My name is Ben Lesh.
I'm Jay Phelps.
My name is Aisha.
My name is Paul Betts.
My name is OJ.
I'm Victor Safkin.
And I'm Jeff Cross.
I'm a software engineer at Netflix, and I'm on the RxJS core team.
I work at Autodesk as a senior software engineer at the cloud platform.
I've worked at Slack for about 2 years. I work on their desktop application.
And I'm currently working for Slack, the messaging app for the work.
We left the Angular team to start this company, Narwhal, last month.
I am the project lead for RxJS 5 in Hire, which is the library that we're all discussing today.
The biggest goal with RxJS 5 was the performance and debuggability of like stack traces and stuff like that.
What most people didn't know is how we accomplished that, why the library exists in the state that it does, what is lift, why do we have all of these additional classes around something that you could probably implement in fewer lines, that sort of thing. So I think that the important takeaways from what's been done that I would like for people to have is some context around why those things exist in the format that they do. Because then when they're in there, like if they want to contribute and look at the code, then they're not going to be totally lost when they're looking at this. Why is this so big? Why do we have all these other classes? We don't need all this stuff. They'll understand, why it is the way it is. Things that were going to improve performance, probably in terms of operations per second. In particular, there was a scheduler refactor that I was looking at that's really important. So the idea for this is actually modeled after Most.js. So I worked with Brian Cavalier and looked at what Most.js was doing. Most.js, if you look at all of the observable type libraries and you kind of run them against each other in the same sort of scenarios, only Most.js is faster than RxJS 5 right now. And it's because it's a lot leaner, but it's also because it's doing one interesting thing, which is it centralizes all of its error handling in one location. So right now, error handling lives throughout Rx. So everywhere you provide, like say you provide a projection function to a map operator, or you provide a function to flat map or whatever, anywhere you provide a function, we're wrapping that in a try-catch in some way, usually the most performant way we can. And if there's an error that comes out of that function, we send it down the error path in the observable. So the problem with that is try-catch causes de-optimizations. So like if there's a try-catch in your function, it can't be inlined by V8, at least currently. And I don't know if it ever will be able to. So what happens is you'll have this call stack where multiple functions in the call stack de-opt, and you can't inline the entire thing or as much of the thing as the engine will allow. So the solution to this that Most.js took is to actually move all the try-catching to as far down to the bottom of the call stack as you can. And in our case, that could be the scheduler. So if we scheduled everything that was going to be dispatched through your observable from the source, then that means if the try-catching is in the scheduler and there's any error downstream, it's going to unwind the stack back to that try-catch, and we can send it on the way. So that way we only have one function that's been de-optimized, and everything above it, the JavaScript engines are free to try to optimize as best they can, provided that the user function passed in doesn't have a try-catch in it or something.
What was cool about RX5 is there were a lot of companies involved with it. Like there was Microsoft involved with it because they had the previous version of RX4. Like Matt Podwazaki was the maintainer of that, and so they had a lot of their own needs going to RX5 they wanted to see. Netflix was the main driver of RX5, or they provided the most resources to it, and they had their own specific needs, mostly around performance and being able to target load-powered devices and high performance scenarios. And we had the Angular team, which we were on, who wanted to make it a core part of Angular 2 that we were working on. So we had our own things we wanted to see, our own problems we wanted to solve with ergonomics and that kind of thing. So we had to come up with, and when I say we, I mean mostly Ben, Paul, Jay, folks working on it, Andre Stoltz, OJ, lots of people contributed. So they had to be able to balance all these needs, and they were really complex needs, like especially with distribution and performance issues. Like we had pretty big demands of things that needed to change throughout the framework.
More on a technical level, like how do we balance that sort of operations per second performance against the need to have your time to first interactive on a web application be happen at an earlier point. So like reducing the download size of RxJS, but still retaining as much as we can of that raw, like CPU type performance.
Right now we're measuring micro performance, or measuring macro performance, but what we're not measuring is how is using Rx affecting your time to first interactive? Like, what is like the download size of this, and like how do you balance those things? I know in like a high performance app or in a Node app, those ops per second really, really matter, like you care. So we need to balance those needs against, what I think more of the masses want, which is like how long is this taking it? And honestly, a lot of the masses don't even really care about that. It would be, again, you look at the Googles and the people there, it's like all of a sudden you have this scale of downloading tons and tons and tons of apps. Or that's not true. If someone's dealing with mobile or like low bandwidth scenarios, then it's going to affect everybody.
Payload size concern comes around the time to interactive and how long does it take to bootstrap an application, mobile application on 2G, 3G connection. And what we see right now is that in Angular applications, RxJS is a sizable chunk of that download size. And there's very little we can do about this because of how RxJS is structured and modularized. And like there were scenarios where we were using RxJS for service worker initialization, and we had to drop it because it was too big. And that makes me sad. And I don't want to get into a scenario where we'll be forced to like rewrite RxJS Lite like we had to do with jQuery Lite in the past, because that would be really bad for the RxJS community. But at the same time, there's so much pressure on us and on the whole web application ecosystem to reduce the code size that we're getting desperate about, what is it that we can do and must do in order to reduce the code size.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big balloons that I think of the code size of RxJS is the fact that we use classes instead of closures. There's a significant, like every operator, you could write it in like, most operators you could write it in a fairly short amount of code, but our code is like huge because we have different classes for each one of those.
I mean, even
when
using
they get
lift, you can
transmiled,
still write it much, much smaller if you use a lot of closures.
We literally have the exact same problem right now, don't we?
Does anyone have any information on what actually takes space? Let's imagine that you have vanilla observable with no operators added. Like, what is it that's taking space, really?
So there are two things that we see. There is schedulers, the way they have written. We have a hard time getting rid of schedulers that are not being used by applications. At least this is what we've seen when investigating. And then the other one is operators. As soon as people use the kitchen sink, put everything on the prototype, you have to use like Clojure compiler and crazy stuff that is hard to do outside of Google in uncontrolled environment. It's not reliable, so you can't really do it. And in that case, you have the ergonomic issues because you need to include operator one by one.
You're saying that's to shrink the size of the code in the operator itself, is that right?
So our goal is, in the final application, we only want the pieces of RxJS that are actually used. Mm-hmm. That means only the schedulers that are used, only the operators that are used by anybody in that application. And this should be done in a way where we can do code splitting, so that if we have just the shell of the application that uses just one operator, but there are some deep routes that use other 5 operators, we should be able to separate the two and load only that one operator in the first, when the application is starting, and later when user navigates to some deep screen, that's when we load the other operators. And we can do this with pretty much all the other code except for RxJS. It's still not perfect, but like we're still slowly iterating on this and making it better and better. But with RxJS, we feel like you either have like big ergonomic issues because you can't just like, ideally we would have like pipe operator or I don't want to say bind operator because there's a lot of like issues around that stuff. But that kind of solution would solve this. We just want to be able to download only what is actually needed at the time.
Right.
The bundling stuff has been a bit of a contentious thing, like whether we should use the operator patching like we have now or do something more functional, not on the prototype. And we discussed today quite a bit about the function bind operator that's been proposed for JavaScript in the TC39 committee, and like how much it would help. It would basically be a deciding factor. Like we have a very clear direction that we should go into.
Yeah, the short version I heard was that pipe operator was kind of DOA because it wasn't Java-ish enough. It wasn't something that was normally found in languages like Java or JavaScript
Yeah, no, that's
or whatever.
an ML. It's an ML thing. It's just
So yeah, that was one side, and then on the function bind operator, the deadlock there is that they're like, oh well, we would really like this to work like C# extension methods, but how do we use that? I think Yehuda Katz had an interesting proposal around using that namespace keyword that has been sitting as a reserved word forever, and being like, namespace. Right. Here's some class type that I want my function bound things to affect, and I'm going to put my functions inside of that, and then now that's available everywhere, for function bind goodness.
Kind of like Ruby had put in there or tried to.
So basically, like what Rx wants is the simplest possible version of function bind, but where the TC39 is getting gridlocked is they want to do really fancy things with function bind, and
I think that's part of it, but also like this 39 is hesitant to push any of the proposals forward if the community can agree on what's the right way. Like even if we can agree what we want, whether it's function bind or type, then this 39 is not going to touch this.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Has there been any active work? Because obviously Angular, RxJS would both be on board. Has there been any active work to have our two communities talk to React and Ember and try and get them also?
Would be
because if we can get all the major libraries on board with one of them, then I think we'd have a much better time convincing them that it is necessary. One thing that's really people get very passionate about is when do we decide to include an operator into the core library? Because there's an infinite number of operators you can come up with, and the criteria for including it has become more and more strict as we've gone along because of being more conscious about our bundle sizes. And that's been kind of frustrating for some people, I can imagine, because like, for example, RxJS 4 supported many more operators than we support in version 5. And they did that because they took a different strategy on their bundling, and we've kind of tried to simplify things. And we may get back to the 4 way of having many different types of bundles that you can npm install, but we've been trying to simplify it so that we can reduce the API surface, because people commonly complain about how many operators there are. We as a core team can hypothesize all we want about what the real problems people are facing are, but hearing from the actual people who are not on the core team, it's just totally invaluable. Like what we think is a priority and what the community thinks, it can be very different. Like, for example, after today, I feel like we should focus a little bit less on the code that we've been doing and focus a lot more and catch up on the documentation side of things, because it's very clear that we have a lot of useful stuff today code-wise, but not a lot of useful documentation around that. Just improving that entire ecosystem, and it really helped. Today really helped solidify that being a priority.
Today we decided to prepare more beginner-friendly examples, and whenever you have an example that you'd like to share, you can just add it to the examples folder, and we will hopefully come up with better ways to add examples as well. And RxJS Marbles is another thing that's it's easy to contribute.
The other thing I wanted to say is, you know the anti-patterns much better than us. You see the problems more. Just put it somewhere so we'll know, and we'll find. I mean, I'm happy to make the example of it, but you guys don't talk too much in your talks too, like what people are doing wrong.
I agree.
Do you guys know the Promise Nuggets thing that's founded a couple of years ago? Promise Nuggets is like it's a one-page or GitHub document of like, this is how you used to do things with async.js, and this is how you do them with Promise. And we need an equivalent thing. It's like, how do I get one thing? How do I get 2 things in parallel? How do I get 2 things in series, right? How do I, like, the 10 most common things you do with asynchronous ops. It'd be good to have the Rx equivalent.
Yeah, I agree, because like, if we are trying to sell like RxJS and like observable stuff to like people who are already used to like promises, and they find like the new hotness is like async await, but this async await is like, it introduces like a ton of problems when you are trying have like multiple stuff. How do you serialize them? How to make sure that only one? How to cancel an existing like promise, or like
was having the idea of an examples folder where you show the non-Rx example next to the Rx example, so people can be like, well, this is how I would do it with imperative code and promises, and this is how I do it with Rx, and they could kind of see some of those wins. And in the case of these foot guns, kind of showing people like, here's an example of how this can be a foot gun, and here's how you get out of it. Like
we don't really have anything like that in our documentation, nor has there been any articles. Like I remember there was a blog article one time on promise anti-patterns, right? I don't know if anybody else remembers that, but it was pretty good. It was pretty enlightening, and I think that our community could really use something like that. Like here is observable anti-patterns. Now here's the fun thing. I love observables more than promises. I think everybody here knows that, but I think that there are probably more anti-patterns with Rx than there are with promises, and that's because you can do so much more with them. So I think it's that's really ripe material for people to have some pretty stellar articles published on, and if people go out and do that and they're good, I will absolutely make sure that gets added to our documentation. It would be even better if we just had those things in our documentation as well. But those are the real action items around that, is examples and coming up with examples of anti-patterns and how to get around them. And that kind of relates to the other things where we're saying we need more examples of how to use these operators in practical real world scenarios. And I have written down here the problem in imperative code and the problem is solved in Rx. So.
There's a lot of work to do, like lots and lots and lots of work to get this right, to meet all the edge cases, and the only way to do that is with all of the other folks that work on it. I would not be able to do it alone. I wouldn't even be able to do it with one other person. Like it's a team effort. It requires a lot of work and a lot of diligence and a lot of really smart people all looking at the same thing to make sure you don't make mistakes.
It's a little scary sometimes because like the choices that you have to make are going to impact a lot of people, particularly on the Angular 2 side, now that they've really adopted Rx as their async library. And so we take that very seriously, and we try and be very cognizant, but while also trying to balance the fact that we don't want to necessarily give Angular 2 too much special treatment. Like we don't want to be RxJS for Angular 2.
When you are using a specific framework or library and things change, and you don't actually have visibility into why these things change, it's very easy to get upset about it. But I'm hoping that with RxJS Contributor Days, what we're able to do is show the human side of open source, and that people are people, and that the framework authors and library authors are actually trying to appeal to the consumers of the actual framework, and really trying to work together in the best way possible to do something amazing for the community.
Well, the reason why I'm bringing this up is we have a lot of experience with this, and since we released Angular version 2 in September, we have this new deal with the community where we basically pledge to not make breaking changes unnecessarily and push against any kind of breaking changes that we would see as unreasonable. And because RxJS is a dependency, this transitively now forces us to talk to you about this stuff, because if you make breaking changes, then affects how we are treating our community, right? So what we pledged to do was we are doing time-based releases. Every 6 months there is a major version, but major version doesn't necessarily mean that it's breaking version. We're doing everything we can to make major versions backwards compatible with the previous one. So using the application warnings, any kind of migration strategies that we can. And we're using the major versions primarily as a communication tool about when things will change and how people should think about the change. Because we don't want to get stuck in the like IE6 or IE8 world where people start coding against bugs. That's not good. But also we don't want to break people unexpectedly, because it's very frustrating when you have a big project with hundreds of developers, and now all of the dependencies are breaking unexpectedly every week.
Is there any specific advice you give us as far as art? Like, do you think that we should switch to a time-based model or not? Because I do like the fact that, like, if the major version bumps, you know that there are breaking changes. Like,
yeah, and that's fine. It's about the frequency and like what are the expectations, like, because the way you're talking about breaking changes, you're like, we're going to document all the breaking changes, and when there's a breaking change, we'll bump major version. But it also sounds like, oh, I can just do this twice a day if I want to, and it's fine. And what I'm trying to say, it's not fine.
Yeah, we don't have any tangible because we just started doing this, we don't know how often we'll be doing it. I mean, if I had to just make a number up, it'd probably be like, we'll probably release version 6 in the next couple months. And then maybe a 7 in a year from then, or like 6 months from then, or something. Like, we don't plan on dumping it often.
I mean, what I foresee with this particular library will be there will be, you know, some series of major versions released over the period of maybe a couple of years, and then it'll slow down to almost nothing. Like, I can't, like, how many ways are you going to implement observable or flat map?
There was a time period where Paul Taylor and I were both working on RxJS at Netflix, and then Paul left Netflix, and I was kind of the only person working on RxJS for a while, and it was this lonely repository where I was trying to get these things out, and the Angular folks were looking at using it. I don't know if they were really using it heavily yet. And then along comes OJ Kwan. I have no idea who this guy is or where he came from, and he comes in and he starts commenting on issues and filing PRs, and he's extremely consistent, and he was doing a great job of vetting other people's pull requests and my own. And so I asked him, like, do you want to be a core team member? And so, like, out of everybody here, he was probably the most exciting thing that happened to me during while working on RxJS. I'm really excited about everybody else I've met too, obviously, but he was the first person that really was just a total random stranger out of nowhere that decided he was going to contribute to RxJS, and he's been an incredible asset ever since.
I could emphasize what other people, such as nuclide people, are using the technology named Electron. That Slack is also heavily relying on that. So we are sharing some kind of same problem that compared to other land of the web browsers or node processes word. So those kind of things are kind of interesting.
I thought it would be really interesting to bring together the RxJS community and converge on ideas so that core contributors can listen to people who are using RxJS all day, and also just bring together all the core contributors in one place at one point in time.
Rx Contributor Days has really been, it's been kind of an experiment. We didn't know how it was going to go. We didn't know what the format should be. And Tracy has just been amazing with the logistics and the planning and so understanding. And I think it went phenomenal. I think it went better than we expected personally. And I hope we do this again. And I hope that other communities actually take our lead on this and being more open, because actually I've seen this as a trend that the communities are becoming more and more and more open. Like React as an example, for the longest time React was very closed and is very basically Facebook is making decisions for their own benefit, and that's fine, but the community is depending on this framework and they have no insight, and they're now publishing their meeting notes, and they're going through more of an RFC style process and being much more open. And I think we're all trying to, as a community, try and head more in that direction. So I hope that the React and Ember and Angular communities also try and do something like Rx Contributor Days.
I think the biggest thing that Rx needs to work on for adoption is debuggability. So like we talked a lot of big ideas. So like, having dev tools and these crazy like visualizations. I think that's definitely something to focus on.
Circling back on the debugger stuff, I did some experimenting early last year with using the Chrome debugger protocol to actually, I created an extension that lets you, when you can pause at any, you can add added like a debugger operator, so you could just add that in your chain anywhere. And basically, when values were actually pumping through your operator chain, it would pause JavaScript and then show you the code, but it wouldn't show you the internals, because in actuality, where you're actually stopping is inside RxJS, and that's the problem. Is that you're like, well, where's my code? And what this would do is when you define your observable chain, it tracks the location. I mean, anytime that when you build that observable chain, it's like, where was I actually defined? Keeps that source location, and instead of showing you really where it's happening, it shows you where you defined your operator. And so it lets you see, like, you'd be stepping through when values are pumping, and you could see, like, if you pumped 1, 2, 3, 4, you would see, 1, and then you'd say next one, and it would go to the next operator, and you'd be able to see how it transforms it, and you'd be seeing your code instead of RxJS's code. Now, all this is super awesome, but the only reason why I never released anything is because it uses the debugger protocol, and you can only use one debugger protocol in Chrome at a time. So Paul Irish was saying last quarter that they were going to work on allowing multiple debugger protocols at the same time, but I just checked and they still have not yet fixed that issue. So it's kind of blocked on that. If anyone has any solutions that don't require the debugger protocol, that'd be great, but I don't know how else we would be able to intercept and get source locations.
Solutions too around anything, just even just visualizing what's happening. Like this is an area where we could use, if anybody from the community wants to contribute something and wants our help doing so, I am happy to spend time with somebody who's got a solid solution for visualizing or helping debug observables. Yeah.
I think the reactive programming as a paradigm is just beginning. I think that it's going to continue to grow exponentially in various communities, not just JavaScript. And I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see a paradigm shift from programming languages to support reactive programming first class within the programming language itself, instead of it being, because if you think about it, one of the hard things about Rx in writing in JavaScript or Java or any of these normal languages is the languages themselves are very procedural and imperative in nature. And then you're basically creating this DSL on top of that imperative stuff. But what if the programming language itself was reactive? And that's something that was experimented with in the 70s and 80s with data flow programming. But at the time, I feel like it was much ahead of its time. Like it was just too early, and people were dismissive of it. And reactive programming and data flow programming are basically two sides to the same coin in many respects. And I think that we're going to see some really exciting things in the coming years in regards to reactive programming.
For those who get to watch RxJS Contributor Days afterwards, I really hope it inspires them to contribute to a new framework or library that they may not have before. Anything that you can do to help out and make a name for yourself, or just even help. I think it's an awesome opportunity for anybody who wants to contribute.
Another good way of contributing is to find out the problems that you are facing and find out the things that are hard for you to understand in a project. Because when people write libraries, they have a set of assumptions in their mind, or they have some specific use cases. But once you start using it, you find different approaches and different issues that you run into that might be very useful for the main contributors to know. And it's a great thing to just go back and say, thank you for doing this, but this is the problem I'm having, and I would like to solve it, and what would you suggest?
Open the PR as soon as possible is always a good thing. People think who are new to open source will always try to open PRs at the very end, because they think it has to be completely finished perfect. But PRs don't have to be perfect. They're works in progress.
If there's a problem, instead of creating an issue ticket, the first thing I do is I try and actually just solve the problem. So if there's some bug in a library, I'll typically search to see if someone else is already talking about this, and if they aren't, or even if they are, I'll look at the source code and see how trivial is this to just fix. Instead of bike shitting back and forth, it's much easier to just quickly throw a pull request out so they can quickly solve the problem.
They solve problems at their job, and they make mistakes, and they do great things at the same time, just like everybody else. In that, I learned that interacting with these folks was easy and straightforward. And I hope that other people out there that want to interact with me in the Rx community that feel the same way. Like, I'm a totally normal guy. Every bit of bad code that's in RxJS, I'm also responsible for, not just the good stuff. As much as I'd like to have it just be the good stuff, but.
One of the beauties about learning Rx is that I can guarantee you that it's going to outlive any UI framework you pick. The UI frameworks change so often the new hotness of the month, whereas Rx has been around for like a decade, and I think it will continue to be around for much longer. It's a skill that will just outlive all of these other UI frameworks because it's cross-functional. Like it's not just tied to a UI framework, and we want to keep that keep the paradigm that way.
We have all these brilliant people around the world working on really hard problems with things that a lot of other people need to do. And if they can give that back to the rest of the world so other people can use it, I think that's a really positive thing. And then getting more and more people involved, and then people learn new things from one another, they contribute back, and it's all free and anyone can use it. I think it's awesome. I'm really happy to be a part of it. I think my favorite moment, honestly, was just coming into a room and seeing all these really brilliant people that I look up to, and they're all here to talk about this library that I've worked on for the last year. And I worked on with a bunch of other people. I'm not saying I'm the only person that delivered this at all. But you know, like I remember starting this, like opening the first file and starting to work on this, not really knowing what I'm doing. And you know, going from that to seeing all these brilliant and wonderful people in this room all collaborating on the same thing and being excited about it, was great. Like it was really touching. Like it made me feel very good about my last year. So.
Hey there, are you into reactive programming using JavaScript? Do you have to deal with asynchrony in your web app? Then join this instructor Ben Lesh to learn all of the ins and outs of RxJS in his hands-on workshop. Available online and in person, go to rxworkshop.com for more details and to book your spot today.